All right, ready to dive deep.
Let's do it.
Today, it's all about synaptic transmission.
Oh, cool.
We're going way beyond those diagrams from Dr. Eldeeb's physiology class.
Definitely.
This is about how thoughts, feelings, even reflexes all come down to those tiny signals between neurons.
It really is amazing when you think about it. Everything we do, every memory, every single decision, it all comes down to these little sparks of communication between brain cells.
So where do we even start with something this complex?
Well, I guess with the basics.
Okay, so the word synapse, we hear it all the time.
Right.
But are we all picturing the same thing? What exactly are we talking about here?
Think of it like a really busy city.
Okay,
And each neuron is like a neighborhood in that city.
I'm with you.
The synapse is the intersection, where they connect.
Yeah.
And they exchange information. It can get pretty busy.
Right, I can see that. But in Dr. Eldeeb's notes, there's this thing called the synaptic knob.
Yeah.
And honestly, it doesn't sound very exciting.
It does kind of sound like a small thing.
Is it just a little bump on the neuron?
Not quite. Imagine a tree, right?
Okay.
With branches splitting off into tons of tiny twigs, thousands, and each twig has this little bulb at the very end.
Yeah.
That's your synaptic knob. And it's packed with these things called neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers of the brain.
Whoa, so each neuron is sending out, what, thousands of these messages all at once?
Yeah, pretty much.
It's like a massive communication network.
It really is.
But how do all those messages actually get across from one neuron to the next?
So there are two main ways: chemical transmission and electrical transmission.
Okay, two options.
Think of chemical transmission kind of like sending a letter.
Okay.
It's got a specific message, it has to be packaged, and it has to go to the right address.
So those neurotransmitters, those are like the packages.
Yeah, they have to bind to the very specific receptors, like the address on the receiving neuron, for the message to get through.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about electrical transmission then?
That's more like a phone call.
Oh, so instant.
It's direct.
Mm-hmm.
Instant. The neurons, they're directly connected through these things called gap junctions.
Mm-hmm.
It's super fast, like instant messaging. But the message is a bit more general, less targeted than those carefully packaged neurotransmitters.
So it's like the brain has a postal service A&D, a high-speed internet connection.
Yeah, something like that.
Pretty cool. But those notes also mention calcium playing a big role.
Right.
I always thought calcium was just for bones.
It does a lot more than that, especially in the brain. It's actually like the key that unlocks those packages of neurotransmitters.
Oh, interesting.
When an electrical signal arrives at the synaptic knob, it opens up calcium channels. And calcium ions, they just flood in.
Okay, I think I get that part. So calcium rushes in, then what? What does it do?
Let me see it. Okay, imagine you're at a concert, the music's loud, everyone's going wild.
Okay, I can picture that.
Suddenly, security opens the doors, and even more people rush in. It's chaos. That's kind of what calcium does. It's a surge of energy that pushes those neurotransmitter packages to the very edge of the neuron, ready to be released.
Okay, so they just spill out into the space between the neurons. Then what happens?
That space, it's called the synaptic cleft.
The synaptic cleft.
And that's where all the magic happens. Those neurotransmitters are like keys searching for the right lock, floating across the cleft, trying to bind to receptors on the receiving neuron.
And if they find the right lock, the message goes through.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Some of these messages actually tell the next neuron to fire.
Okay.
Those are the excitatory signals. But others actually tell the next neuron to hold back, to not fire. And those are the inhibitory signals.
Wait, so it's not just a one-way street like go, go, go.
Yeah.
The brain has its own brakes too.
Absolutely. Remember, we're talking about billions of neurons all talking at the same time.
Right.
It's like an orchestra. You need the loud, exciting parts.
Yeah.
And the quiet, calming parts, too, to make the music work.
That's a great analogy. So how does the brain decide whether to hit the gas or the brakes?
It's complicated, but the notes mention these two types of summation.
Okay.
Spatial summation and temporal summation.
Spatial and temporal. All right, break those down for me. What's spatial summation?
Spatial summation is kind of like getting input from a ton of different sources all at once.
All at once, okay.
Imagine you're trying to decide what to eat for dinner.
Always a tough decision.
You've got your friends giving suggestions, you're looking at recipes online, you might even be thinking about what you had last week.
Yeah, I do that.
Right? So all of those inputs combine to influence your decision, your final decision.
That makes sense. And temporal summation. What's that like?
It's like when your friend keeps texting you over and
Yeah.
over to remind you about their party.
Yeah. We got a friend like that.
So that repeated message, it can eventually sway you, even if other friends are suggesting doing something else.
So it's all about the combination of signals, like where they're coming from, how often they're coming in. It seems like a lot to keep track of.
It really is. But the brain's like the master conductor, weaving all these different signals together to create this beautiful symphony of activity.
Amazing. But before we get too carried away with the music metaphors, I want to talk about something called synaptic inhibition.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one.
Is that just a fancy way of saying the brain's hitting the brakes?
It's a bit more complicated than that. We've been talking about inhibitory signals, but synaptic inhibition, it's really about how those signals get controlled and fine-tuned.
Oh, so more like a control panel.
Yeah. And Dr. Eldeeb actually mentions two fascinating mechanisms: presynaptic inhibition and negative feedback.
Okay, let's unpack those. What's presynaptic inhibition? What are we talking about there?
Imagine you're writing a letter, right?
Mm-hmm.
But before you can even mail it, somebody intercepts it and throws it away. That's basically what presynaptic inhibition does. It stops the neurotransmitter message from even being released.
So it's like a gatekeeper. That can shut down communication before it even starts.
Pretty much.
That's powerful. Okay, and what about negative feedback?
Think of a thermostat.
For thermostat, okay.
When the room gets too hot, the thermostat turns on the AC to cool things down. Negative feedback in the brain works in a similar way.
Oh, interesting.
If a neuron gets too excited, it basically triggers mechanisms that dampen its own activity to keep things from getting out of control.
So it's like a self-regulation system for the brain.
Yeah, it's got its own checks and balances to keep
Yeah.
everything running smoothly.
I'm learning so much. This is fascinating. But I'm curious about those unique properties of synaptic transmission Dr. Eldeeb talked about. Things like synaptic delay and fatigue.
Oh, right. Those are really interesting.
Can we dive into those next?
Absolutely. That's where things get even more intriguing. You know, we've been talking about how these signals, they zip between neurons, but there's actually a tiny little delay at each synapse.
Really?
Yeah, it's called synaptic delay.
Synaptic delay.
And it's only about half a millisecond.
Half a millisecond. That seems so tiny. Why does it even matter if things are moving that fast?
Well, think about how many synapses are involved. And even like a simple thought or an action.
Oh, that's true.
Those little delays add up.
I guess they would.
Remember our letter analogy?
Yeah, with the packages and addresses.
It takes time to unpack a message and read it.
Right.
It takes time for those neurotransmitters to bind and trigger a response in that next neuron.
So it's like a chain reaction, but with a pause at each link.
Kind of.
Does that mean our brains are actually slower than we think they are?
I don't think it's about being slow. It's about precision. Those delays, they might actually play a role in how we process information and make decisions.
That's interesting.
Imagine if everything happened instantaneously. We'd be overwhelmed.
That's true. We'd be bombarded with information.
Right. Unable to filter out what's important.
Like drinking from a fire hose.
Exactly.
You know, Dr. Eldeeb's notes also mention synaptic fatigue, which makes me wonder, do neurons ever get tired?
They do.
Really?
Yeah, just like muscles can get fatigued. After a workout,
Right.
neurons can experience a temporary decrease in their responsiveness.
So if they're stimulated too much?
If they're stimulated repeatedly,
Okay.
it's actually a protective mechanism.
To prevent what? Damage?
Yeah, to prevent damage and overstimulation.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Like the brain knows its limits.
Mm-hmm.
I've definitely felt that kind of mental fatigue before. Like after hours of studying or working on a hard problem.
Absolutely. That feeling of mental exhaustion, it might actually reflect the fatigue of those neurons.
Oh, wow.
And, it's not just mental exertion that can affect synaptic transmission.
Really? What else?
Dr. Eldeeb also talks about the impact of pH and oxygen levels.
Oh, right.
I mean, our brains need oxygen, right? Just like any other organ in our body.
To function properly.
Exactly. Even a brief period of oxygen deprivation, it can disrupt synaptic transmission
Oh, wow.
and lead to problems with thinking clearly.
So all the more reason to take care of ourselves, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like eating right, exercising, getting enough sleep,
Oh, that good stuff.
keeps those synapses happy.
It all contributes to a healthy environment for your brain.
For those synapses to do their thing.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of things that affect synaptic transmission, we can't forget about drugs.
Oh, right, drugs.
I know certain drugs can have powerful effects on mood, behavior, even how we perceive the world.
Definitely.
How does that all tie back to the synapse?
Well, a lot of drugs actually exert their effects by altering how neurotransmitters work.
Oh, interesting.
Some drugs, they might mimic
So
neurotransmitters.
they bind to the receptors.
Yeah, and trigger a response.
Tricky.
Others might actually block the receptors.
Oh, so the real neurotransmitters can't get in.
Exactly. And some drugs, they even affect how neurotransmitters are released or even reabsorbed.
Wow, so they really mess with the whole system.
It's like they can hijack the brain's communication system,
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
amplifying some signals, shutting down others.
And the effects can be huge, right?
Yeah, it depends on which neurotransmitter systems are affected.
Right, that makes sense.
For example, drugs that increase dopamine activity.
Dopamine, like what, cocaine and amphetamines?
Yeah, things like that, they can lead to feelings of euphoria and increased energy.
But they also can be really addictive.
Yeah, and lead to long-term damage to the brain.
Right, so definitely not worth it.
No, not at all.
It's amazing how these tiny little chemical processes,
Synapse.
yeah, can cause such a wide range of experiences.
Yeah, it really is.
From a caffeine buzz to the effects of those harder drugs.
Absolutely.
It really highlights how powerful those connections are.
It really does. And perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all of this is synaptic plasticity.
Synaptic plasticity. I don't think I've heard of that one.
It means that our brains are constantly changing and adapting. Oh, interesting.
Those connections between neurons.
Yeah,
They're not static.
so they can change.
They're dynamic.
Yeah.
They can get stronger or weaker
Wow.
over time based on our experiences.
So are you saying our brains are literally rewiring themselves based on what we learn and experience?
Yeah, to a certain extent.
That's incredible.
Think about learning a new skill, like playing an instrument or learning a new language.
Okay, yeah.
The more you practice, the stronger those connections become.
And the better you get.
Exactly. That's synaptic plasticity in action.
So it's like building a muscle, but for the brain?
That's a great way to think about it. And just like muscles can atrophy if you don't use them.
If you're sitting on the couch all day,
Right. Those synaptic connections can weaken if they're not being used.
use it or lose it.
Exactly. It's why it's so important to challenge ourselves mentally and keep learning new things.
I like that. Makes a lot of sense. But how does this plasticity work at the level of the synapse?
Well, Dr. Eldeeb's notes describe two main processes, potentiation
Okay.
and depression. Potentiation and depression, so like good and bad.
Kinda. Potentiation, it's also called facilitation.
Okay.
And it refers to the strengthening of those synaptic connections.
So making those connections stronger.
Yeah. There's short-term potentiation.
Like a quick boost.
Yeah, like a temporary boost in signal strength.
Okay.
And then there's long-term potentiation,
Which is
or LTP,
LTP.
and that involves longer-lasting changes.
So LTP is like etching those memories and skills into our brains
You could say that.
permanently.
It involves actual changes to the synapse itself, making it more efficient at sending those signals.
Wow.
And then on the flip side, there's synaptic depression.
Which is when those connections get weaker.
Right. Habituation is one common example of that.
Habituation.
It's like when we're exposed to the same thing over and over again.
Like that dripping faucet that used to drive me crazy.
Exactly. Our brains, they just tune it out eventually.
You don't even notice it anymore.
The synapse that's responsible for processing that stimulus, it becomes less responsive.
That's so interesting. The brain is really good at adapting.
It is. And then there's long-term depression.
Or LTD.
Yeah, or LTD, which is essentially the opposite of LTP.
Okay.
It involves a weakening of those connections.
So that's like forgetting things.
It could play a role in forgetting
Yeah.
or unlearning information.
Like those math formulas I learned in high school.
Exactly.
Long gone.
So it's like our brains are constantly pruning connections that aren't being used.
And strengthening the ones that are
Right.
like a gardener.
That's a good way to think about it.
But what about those neurotransmitters and neuromodulators that Dr. Eldeeb mentioned?
Oh, yeah.
What are they up to?
So neurotransmitters, those are the main messengers.
The ones delivering the messages.
Right, the ones that directly trigger a response in the receiving neuron.
Okay.
Neuromodulators, on the other hand, they're like the stage crew.
Siege crew?
They don't have the starring role,
Okay.
but they're behind the scenes.
Making sure everything runs smoothly.
Yeah, influencing the performance by tweaking how those neurotransmitters work.
So neurotransmitters deliver the message and neuromodulators fine-tune it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And there are a lot of different neurotransmitters, right?
Oh yeah, tons. Each with its own specific effects.
Like dopamine and serotonin, those are always in the news.
They're definitely key players.
What do they do again?
Dopamine, it's often associated with reward and motivation,
Okay.
and serotonin. It's involved in regulating mood, sleep, and appetite.
They both sound pretty important.
They are.
But there are others too, right?
Oh, yeah, lots of others, each with their own unique role.
It's like this complex symphony of chemicals
Yeah.
orchestrating all our thoughts and feelings and everything.
It really is.
But how does all of this translate into actual actions? What about those reflex actions we talked about earlier?
Oh, reflexes. They're a great example of how all of these processes we've been discussing come together.
To produce a response.
Exactly. And Dr. Eldeeb's notes actually go into quite a bit of detail about how those reflex arcs work.
Okay, I think I'm ready to connect all the dots now. Bring on the reflex action deep dive. Okay, reflexes. We keep coming back to reflexes.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, I mostly just think of that knee-jerk thing.
The one doctors do.
Yeah.
It's a good example, but reflexes are so much more than that.
What else is there?
Think about pulling your hand away from a hot stove.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Or even blinking.
When something flies toward your eye.
Exactly. Those are all reflexes.
And they happen all the time.
Constantly, without us even realizing.
So it's like our body's autopilot.
Yeah, reacting quickly.
To protect us.
Absolutely.
So what's going on in our brains when that happens?
It's all about the reflex arc.
Reflex.
The pathway those signals take.
Oh, okay.
It starts with a receptor.
Receptor.
It senses change in the environment.
Okay, so like what?
The heat from a stove, or maybe the pressure of something touching your skin.
So is it kind of like an alarm system?
Yeah, constantly checking what's going on around us.
And when that alarm goes off, what happens?
A sensory neuron carries that signal
to the brain.
To the central nervous system. So yeah, the brain or the spinal cord.
Okay, so then what? The brain decides what to do.
For the simple reflexes, the decision is actually made in the spinal cord.
Really?
Yeah. The sensory neuron connects directly to a motor neuron, which sends a signal back out to the muscle, telling it to contract.
So that's how we can pull our hand away from something hot before we even realize it hurts.
Exactly. It's called a monosynaptic reflex.
Monosynaptic meaning?
There's only one synapse involved.
Oh, I see.
It's like a direct line. Super fast.
That makes sense. But what about more complex reflexes then?
The ones that aren't just about avoiding danger.
Right.
Those involve interneurons in the spinal cord or the brain.
So more synapses.
Yeah, adding more to the pathway.
Is it kind of like a conference call then? Instead of just a one-on-one conversation?
Exactly. More processing, more integration of information.
And that allows for
more complex responses.
Okay, so like what would be an example of a more complex reflex?
Walking.
Walking. That's a reflex.
Well, part of it is, think about all the tiny adjustments your muscles are making.
Just to keep us upright.
Yeah, all those signals, it's all coordinated by reflex arcs.
Wow, I never would have thought of it that way.
It's pretty amazing, right?
It is, and what's even crazier is that we're born with a lot of these reflexes.
Right, we don't even have to learn them.
They're just there.
Hardwired into our systems. Those are the innate reflexes.
Innate, okay.
And they're essential for survival.
But we can also learn reflexes, right?
Yes. Conditioned reflexes.
Oh, right. Conditioned reflexes.
We learn them through experience and association.
Like Pavlov's dogs.
Exactly. They drool at the sound of a bell because they've learned to associate it with food.
It's like their brains have been rewired.
Which brings us back to synaptic plasticity.
Ah, there it is again.
Right. It's the key to learning and memory.
So even our learned responses, they all come down to those changes at the synapse.
It all comes back to the synapse. It's really the foundation of how we interact with the world.
Incredible. So we've gone from the tiny synaptic knob to the amazing plasticity of the brain.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. And to think, it's all happening inside us.
All the time.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface here, but I feel like I have a much better understanding now of how my brain works.
It's a fascinating world in there.
It really is. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive.
You're welcome. It's been fun.
And for everyone listening, until next time, keep those synapses firing.